Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome for joining the Meet the President session for the Presidential Visit to Hong Kong 2021. My name is Hong. I'm the Regional Director of ICE Hong Kong. So in this session, Rachel is very much interested to hear from our members for any questions about ICE or the presidential frame of shipping net zero. So if you have any question, please type your question in the Q&A box, and we will answer the question during the Q&A session. Without further ado, I would like to invite Rachel to deliver the presidential address to our Hong Kong members. Rachel, please.
Thank you very much, Hong, and hello everybody. Fantastic to be able to join you this evening, your time, obviously still this morning, my time. I'm having a very low carbon year because clearly I've not been able to travel anywhere to do any of these visits, but it is fantastic that I've been speaking to so many thousands of people all over the world, all the way through the course of my year. So very briefly, what I want to do just to kind of open, I suppose, a conversation with all of you today is I do want to share quickly some headlines to do with my theme called Shaping Zero for this year. But I also want to just take the opportunity to give you an update on 3 or 4 of the areas of recent change and improvement from an institution of civil engineers point of view that I hope it'll be useful for you to know about from your own perspective as members in Hong Kong. So starting off with my theme, I suspect most of you already know, and some of you may have seen that the Shaping Zero film that came out last November, so you'll know what I'm talking about already. Essentially, my laser-focused singular theme for this whole year is all basically to do with climate action and the role, the responsibility that all of us as civil engineers absolutely have to play and take responsibility for all over the world if we're going to do 2 things. If we're going to, first of all, secure a net zero carbon position, well, by whatever year you choose to mention, it just so happens that Hong Kong and the UK share an ambition towards 2050 in that regard, but also to do with defending against the onward impacts of climate change that we know are still to come. And actually, if we're honest, we are not yet ready for, again, across the world. Obviously, this is a topic that I feel certainly is of absolute utmost urgency. It is genuinely the key to our long run future on the planet. And so this is something where, from a civil engineering point of view, it just strikes me we have an absolutely central role to play if we want to take it, if we choose to take that role. If we choose not to take the role in terms of playing on both reducing our emissions and on helping to build our resilience to the change that lies ahead, actually I think we can only expect to find that other people step in and take on that responsibility for us, because these are all tasks that absolutely need to be done. So there is a fantastic opportunity for civil engineering here, in my view at least, in terms of really making sure that we make that difference for the world in future, and we make the difference in terms of improving lives and enabling growth. And also all of the other benefits to do with social equality and so on, and the environmental side of things that come about through acting on the climate crisis. The reason, as I'm sure many of you have picked up already, why I am so passionate about this particular topic is that it is possible to link infrastructure, so all of the different sectors that we work in across the whole of civil engineering, we can link infrastructure to roughly 70% of the world's global carbon dioxide emissions. And that's when you think about this to do with both the direct emissions but also the indirect side of things. And it's because those carbon dioxide emissions are the primary cause of climate change in the world today. So the way that we go about planning and designing and building, all of our processes all contribute to those carbon emissions, but also the fact that we are creating infrastructure which is then used by all of society in order to go about their daily lives. But those pieces of infrastructure, those systems, also contribute every single day over generation after generation to those same carbon dioxide impacts as things stand today. That there are so many links here between not just the climate action SDG or Sustainable Development Goal, but also all of the other Sustainable Development Goals that all across the world we know that everybody is striving to work towards in terms of just trying to create a better quality of life for everybody. And it just strikes me that if we don't get to grips with the climate action piece of this, then actually our actions against some of the other sustainable development goals will have to fall away. They'll be overshadowed because we will be so distracted by the necessity and the by then really crucial urgency of the pieces to do with climate action that we've simply continued to ignore for too long. So I think overall, in terms of how we describe what we need to do, we need essentially to put our actions into two very large bundles, and there are hundreds of actions that we need to think about taking as a whole community of civil engineers all over the world against each of those sort of big bundles or buckets of action. The first bit is to do with our attack strategy on carbon emissions. We have the ability to change the way we work and essentially to take carbon out of everything we do and to bring through new solutions that allow us to process much more carbon out of the atmosphere at the same time. If we cannot attack the levels of carbon dioxide that are already up there in the atmosphere and that we are in part responsible for creating every single day through our work, whether that's the materials we use, whether it's the quantities of those materials, whether it's the detail of exactly where we put different pieces of infrastructure, how it works and so on, if we cannot figure out where the carbon impacts are currently hiding, and if we cannot find ways to reduce that down, then we are essentially failing to attack the problem in the way that we should be. It doesn't mean we can't build anything, it just means we have to be much more conscious of those carbon impacts, and we need to find ways to mitigate or to offset those impacts as we go forward, because it is, to me at least, unacceptable that we are continuing as a whole industry at the moment to actually cause harm to the wider world around us. On the defence side of things, the second bundle of actions, there is a lot of work to do to understand the climate risk that exists out there today in terms of what is actually going to change over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and to get more comfortable with the uncertainty of where we're going. At the moment, we tend to design and to build infrastructure and to run infrastructure systems according to the way the world was some decades ago, and to do with the level of risk that existed at that time, to do with, for example, extreme weather events and that kind of thing. But we know we are heading into a period of rapid change. We know that our current infrastructure isn't really ready to cope with that. And we know also that anything new we create is going to have to cope with a very different set of conditions to what we would have had to cope with, say, 40, 50 years ago, before we were starting to see some of these more recent changes in our climate beginning to come through in practice. So to me, the speed really matters. It isn't so much about getting every single change perfect from the first run or the first go at these changes. It's much more around everybody trying to go in the same direction as quickly as we can and trying to find ways to make these changes without obviously adding significant cost to what we do. And quite honestly, we've spent nearly 70 years actually ignoring this issue. We've known about climate change for that long. It's been creeping up on us all the time. And now this decade is the crucial one where we have to take this action in terms of both attacking and decarbonising all of our systems, but also defending against what we know is going to come. And I know from a Hong Kong point of view, there is a lot of good work that is happening in some of these spaces, but everywhere in the world, the context is different, but the need for action is broadly the same. So this is really something we can all be working on. We can all be working on together. I suspect that sort of tells you enough in terms of where I'm coming from, and hopefully matches up with other things that you've heard me talking about over the course of this year. I have been absolutely staggered, amazed really about the response I've had to this particular theme. I have people coming to me genuinely shocked. They had no idea about the link between what we all do and the onward, climate impact, the wider impact of what we do. They really didn't know that what we were doing was causing harm, and now they're beginning to understand the need for change. I have other people coming to me who've understood this problem for years, and they are just so excited. They're so relieved that we're finally going to be talking about it. So I think from either point of view, from either type of reaction, it does feel here that we're setting off something which will now become a part of the way that we have to think about essentially delivering everything we do across the whole of the civil engineering landscape. So linked to that, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes now just to start to talk a little bit around some of the changes from an ICE point of view that we are bringing through. Some of these relate to that climate action agenda, if you like, that I was just talking about there. And some of these are more general changes that are going on in any case in order just to try to improve the way that the Institution of Civil Engineers works, and in particular for groups of members, for example, all of you in Hong Kong, helps to make sure that we're learning out of COVID and we're taking best advantage of the way we can now work going forward in order to keep some of these international links not just in existence, but strengthening and growing and building over time. So one of the first things I wanted to mention to all of you, and some of you may already have picked up on some of the information about this, is the fact that next year the Institution of Civil Engineers is hoping to be able to start to offer a second professional qualification or a second title alongside the Chartered Civil Engineer title, which I know many of you will already hold or are working towards at the moment. So at the moment, when the Institution of Civil Engineers qualifies somebody at chartered level, they become a chartered engineer, and they specifically become a chartered civil engineer. We have noticed over quite a number of years that the disciplines, that the profession of civil engineering, of course, is changing. And in particular with the introduction of a lot of the digital thinking and the systems thinking and so on, but also some of the technical spaces that have previously sat on sort of on the outer fringes of civil engineering are becoming much more important to our projects and the delivery of programs every single day across the whole of our industry. So what we are proposing to do, and this does require the agreement of our membership, there will be a vote, so a ballot on this in February of next year. We are proposing to introduce a second qualification title, which will be called a Chartered Infrastructure Engineer. So as well as being able to award a Chartered Civil Engineer title, it would mean that the ICE is also able to professionally qualify people as Chartered Infrastructure Engineers. The reason for that is we know these people are already here within the civil engineering sectors. We know that actually quite a lot of people who perhaps don't consider themselves to be pure civil engineers are actually taking on quite significant leadership roles in many of our projects, and certainly that digital and the system skill sets, and as I say, some of the wider skill sets are now absolutely crucial in the wider infrastructure space to what we do. So it feels right that we should offer a broader qualification to people who would like to become members of the ICE, but perhaps, as I say, don't necessarily consider that their career path to date, or indeed their forward career path, would necessarily badge them as a pure civil engineer. So I'm really excited about this proposal. I think it will be a fantastic achievement if the ICE can actually get to the point where we can award this second professional qualification. It means that we will have a wider range of expertise within the Institution of Civil Engineers whole community, and it means that we will be able to, I suppose, comment on and be seen out in the world as being on topics of far wider relevance to the wider world than perhaps others might assume we are at the moment. It essentially gives a professional home to far more people, and I know there are lots of people I've talked to who are very excited about the opportunity to be able to join us as chartered members through this new route if we can open it up. So I'm very happy to talk a bit more about that if people have questions on it. But the important message for today is that it does require the agreement of members to do this. So those of you who are corporate members and voting members of the ICE will have the opportunity to help us to make that change when the vote opens in February. One of the other areas I wanted just to update you on, and this does relate back to some of the sustainability and the climate action pieces I was just talking about. We've been doing a lot of work to streamline the membership requirements for people who are wanting to join the ICE at whichever level they want to, whether it's engineering technician or incorporated engineer or chartered engineer status, or indeed as fellows. It's become obvious over the years that on the one hand, there was a really strong desire to make sure that standards were held very high, which of course we all agree with. And that is a good thing. It is good that we are perceived to have a high standard and to require a high standard from people who want to become professionally qualified with the ICE. But actually, in some ways, perhaps some elements of that have gone too far. and there were unnecessary requirements in there that were starting to make it difficult for people who really wanted to come through the ICE system, and they were finding that in fact some of the slightly unnecessary requirements were in fact blocking people or even preventing them from getting to the point of applying at all. So there's been a lot of work to simplify things and to take out unnecessary pieces of the processes, but at the same time we've also been refreshing and updating all of the detail of the attributes in terms of what we require from people as and when they come forward for professional qualifications. And the bit that I'm really excited about in there is that while we have had a sustainability attribute, as many of you will know, for many, many years, if we are honest, that sustainability attribute hasn't necessarily reflected the reality of what the world now needs from civil engineers to do with all aspects of sustainability, but in particular the climate action piece that I was just talking about. So we are doing a lot of work to make sure that the UN Sustainable Development Goals come through much more clearly in the member attributes. We're making sure that in terms of academic course content, in terms of CPD, in terms of just generally the requirements, the expectations for members at all grades, this will become something where everybody is just expected to be able to explain why it is that their work is genuinely a part of solving all of these huge world problems. First among those, from my point of view, certainly would be the climate action piece, but of course all of the other UN Sustainable Development Goals are also important there as well. So we are trying to make sure that as a community we are bringing that conversation to life, and we are not simply acting in a separate channel to do with qualifying people and then suddenly surprising them with this idea they also need to understand the sustainability side of things. And I think that's a really, really positive step. Another one, I guess the third of my little list of 4 here that I wanted to talk to you all about is directly related to my theme of Shaping Zero. One of the things that we have launched very recently, although there's been a lot of work going on all year on this, is we are now offering people the opportunity to become a carbon champion if they feel they have an example as a team or as an individual, so it can be groups of people who apply. If you feel you have a great example where you've actively looked to reduce carbon in the way that you are working on a particular project or program, it can be anything at all, from the earliest of strategies to early stage design, all the way through to site work, and indeed through to the operation of our different infrastructure systems. We are really, really keen to build up this community of carbon champions, essentially so that we can prove with some real evidence that people are genuinely finding ways to do things differently, which deliver the outcomes we want from our infrastructure projects and all of our civil engineering work, whilst also being much more helpful in terms of causing less harm when it comes to the carbon impact, that wider climate impact of what we do. So we've just announced the first group of carbon champions a little bit earlier on this month. And now we have a really healthy pipeline coming through of people who want to become carbon champions as well. And so if any of you are aware that you have good examples that you'd like to share, there is a very, very simple process through which you can apply. And then from there, obviously, you can be considered to become essentially one of these carbon champions. And the idea, once we have a community properly established, of course, is that we can be sharing best practice and we can be talking amongst ourselves in terms of how we really bring through this change at speed in terms of reducing the carbon impact of what we do, which of course I was just talking about a few minutes ago. The last thing I just wanted to mention very quickly, because I suspect it will be useful and relevant to those of you obviously based in Hong Kong. Through COVID, some of you will be aware that the process by which the professional reviews have been happening obviously would normally have taken place through a face-to-face interview in terms of particularly the chartership level professional reviews. It was possible before COVID to opt to have a remote review or an online review, but it was very, very rare for that to happen. Obviously with COVID, we had to flip everything to being online for a period of time. And now, as we are trying to work out how best to organise things for the future, it's become really obvious that the feedback from people who've gone through the online chartered professional review process is incredibly positive. And so what we are planning to do is we will maintain the option for people to be able to take their chartered professional review online. So anybody, wherever they are in the world, it doesn't matter whether they're sitting in the middle of London or whether they're in Hong Kong or whether they're anywhere else, anybody will be able to choose whether they want to take their chartered professional review online or whether they want to actually attend an in-person review. So there will still be the opportunity for reviews to happen in Hong Kong in person on a fairly frequent basis, but every 2 months there will be the opportunity for people to opt for the online chartered reviews if that's what they would prefer to do. So this is obviously great in terms of reducing costs, reducing air travel, the associated carbon cost of that. It basically gives people options, which to my mind is a really, really positive thing in terms of how we go forward and learn the best bits, if you like, from COVID, while putting down some of the practices that may have felt a little bit old-fashioned in terms of the way we've gone about until now. So I think rather than me talking for any longer now, I will stop because I'm really, really keen to get to questions from all of you. I understand we've got lots of questions that people have already asked that they want to put to me, so I'm slightly worried about what those might be, but that's okay. But obviously, if any of you listening now want to put questions, I guess it's into the Q&A box, is it, Hong? Is that right? If people put questions in there, then I think between us, we will try and do our best to get through as many as possible. So thank you very much. I hope that's been a useful, if rapid, update in terms of, first of all, what I've been talking about, but also some of the other changes that the ICE has been bringing through over the last few months. Very happy to do my best to answer any questions any of you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for your presidential address. So as mentioned, Rachel said, we really want to interact with our members. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask a question, and we will answer as many as possible. Before we start the Q&A session, I would like to also introduce the other panels today. So we have Louis Wong, ICE Hong Kong Association Chairman. We have Ken Ho, ICE Council Representative from Hong Kong. And also we also have Athena, ICE HKA GNS Committee Chair Lady. So our panel members will, on behalf of our members, to ask questions to Rachel. So before further ado, may I start with Ken, please? Can you ask the first question to Rachel, please?
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Right, good. The first question relates to carbon. And it goes like this. The Hong Kong government has set its target to achieve carbon neutrality before 2050, which is very ambitious. In your opinion, what are the 3 most important areas that we civil engineers can contribute to achieve this target? The second part of the question is this. COP26 will soon be held in Glasgow. What would be some of the potential outcomes that could bring the most impact to our civil engineering profession? Thank you.
That's a big question, isn't it, to start with? But that's great. So on the first bit, in terms of what are the 3 or however many important areas that we as civil engineers can sort of best contribute to the climate action side of things. I think that question is specific in terms of it's the net zero carbon by 2050 that we're getting at here. I'm actually just going to point to one thing. The most important thing that every single one of us as civil engineers can do, and it starts like today, the most important thing we can each do is just take time to stop and think about our individual professional roles, because we all do different things and we all know different things, but to stop and think about where is the carbon impact in what I do, you know, in every single project that you're currently working on with the clients you currently work for, or if you are in a client organization, the things that are being you know, pushed through as briefs and scopes and as work that's going to be done by others. If we all actually understand where the carbon emissions are inside our work, that is the start point to be able to reduce that impact. If we have no idea where the carbon is, there is no point suggesting that any of us are trying to really help towards this problem, because actually we haven't really taken the time just to stop and think. So it is a really complex problem, because of course the context is very different depending on where you are in the world, and the context is very different depending on which sector you work in and which stage of the life cycle you work at. There are so many different things we can all do, but the start point of everything is just almost just to stop and think, as I say, about where is the impact in what you do. So from a Hong Kong point of view, as I've understood it, and you will all understand this far better than I do, that the impact to do with energy generation, to do with transport, to do with, you know, just the way things work in Hong Kong. If those are the things where you have the potential to think about doing things differently, that is the contribution that individually we can each make. And we have to trust that between all of us, we've got our hands on an awful lot of different things around the world. And if we start to take action, it really could make a difference. In terms of the COP26 side of the question, yes, of course, lots of excitement here about COP26 happening in a few short weeks' time, as you would expect. On the one hand, what we can expect to see is a lot of political, sort of national government level commitment to hopefully ever tighter climate targets. We know there will be a better balance than there has been in the past between the pieces to do with net zero and the pieces to do with resilience, which is exactly why I'm talking about the attack and the defence strategies, because those are the two bits that we need to focus on. Those political goals and so on are what they are. The impact, though, for us, I think, if we want it, is to take the opportunity to use the COP26 conversation to really start to speed up the change that we all would like to see happening across the whole of civil engineering. If we wait for COP26 to tell us what to do in a specific sense, we will be left disappointed, because it's not a conference for civil engineers, if that makes sense. It is a political conference. It is the place where the deals and the decisions will be done in terms of who is prepared to commit to what. But in reality, the delivery of that isn't in the hands of those politicians. It's in hands like ours in terms of, you know, just how do we change the way we actually do things. So I think we have to use the interest and the energy from COP26 that will be generated, but actually, if anything, use it as an accelerator to try to get things done much more quickly, and almost to use that as an excuse, use COP26 as the excuse to need to talk about it now. I guess the other thing is we mustn't forget to keep talking about it after COP26 as well, because there is, you know, in itself, the COP conferences keep the issue alive, but they don't in themselves actually, you know, necessarily help to solve the problem in that moment.
Thank you, Rachel. Actually, may I ask a follow-up question on your in response to your comments? I think for civil engineers, feedbacks from some of the fellow civil engineers, as we understand, during the construction stage, a significant portion of the carbon emissions from the construction materials itself, the embedded carbons. So I heard some feedbacks from our fellow engineers that there's not many things I can do with reducing the embedded carbon. As long as we are still using concrete, we are still using steel, the embedded carbon are there. There are not much we can do to reduce that embedded carbons. May I ask Rachel, have you heard similar argument in the UK, and how you are going to deal with that in the UK? Thank you.
Sure. No, absolutely. This is a conversation that is alive, which is a good thing. The impact of concrete and of steel in terms of the global carbon emissions picture is huge. Both concrete, which is essentially it's the cement production piece that's the problem there, and also the steel production processes. That each one of those is responsible for roughly 8% of the global carbon dioxide emissions that are out there, which, if that was a country, either one of them would be the third largest emitter in the world, which is pretty scary. No, it is absolutely right that we should be concentrating on this. I think there are two things, from a civil engineering point of view, there are two things we should think about when it comes to materials. And I'm going to take this right up to that sort of top level, because obviously there's masses of detail that falls out underneath. But the first thing is to do with the materials themselves. There is innovation happening in terms of lower carbon concrete, you know, I guess the technicalities of the mix and the use cases, and what actual strength do we need, what actual mix do we really need in terms of the actual concrete that we're pouring, because obviously we don't need to be using the same types of concrete everywhere, and we don't need to be using the same traditional materials that we have done for years. The really scary thing about the concrete production side of things is that the production process itself is not just energy intensive, but it actually generates directly carbon dioxide as a byproduct of its production, which is just terrifying. So there is work going on in order to come up with lower carbon concrete, and some people are even saying zero carbon concrete in terms of what's coming through. The challenge is to turn that from a set of trials and pilots and experiments to get that through at scale. So, for example, in the UK, I am aware of several examples now of real live construction projects where they have committed to using those lower carbon concretes. Some of it's to do with flood defences. There are things to do with well, all sorts of different sectors are starting to use these materials. In reality, there is still a risk associated with those things because we obviously don't have 40, 50 years of history to look at in terms of how these materials cope over time. But certainly that sort of thing is beginning to come through. So the trick is to take it mainstream. The other thing, the really big thing that we can all do differently is to think about the quantities of materials that we specify. At the moment, a lot of our codes and standards are set around safety requirements, which is obviously absolutely understandable because we don't want things to be unsafe. But if anything, it leads to, in some cases, an over design and over specification of materials because we are, we're almost taking things to an extreme because those standards were not written with carbon impacts in mind at all. So somehow we need to find a better balance around the quantity of materials we specify, what's really needed, but also the amount of waste that is built into a lot of those systems. Certainly in the UK, there is a very scary set of statistics about the amount of construction materials that in fact go to waste because of over ordering and people being overly careful in terms of making sure they don't run out of things. But that is a complete waste of the whole process because you're literally putting things in a skip, essentially taking them away again at the end. So I think both on the materials side and the quantities and the waste side, there is a lot that can be done there. So anybody who says they can't do anything, I would say maybe think again.
Thank you, Rachel. May I now invite Louis to ask the next question, please?
So this is a question about choosing civil engineering as a career. So you say that in Hong Kong, the most popular career is like finance, insurance, and law, and all this. So civil engineer is not so attractive to the young student to choose it when they enter the university because the working hours too long, need to working outdoor, and also very high working pressure, and the promotion path is too long. So the question is, can you share with us the situation of young people in choosing career in UK? This is first question. And the second question is civil engineering an attractive career to them? And how IC can draw their interest and promote IC to encourage them to join and take this as a lifelong career? So two questions, yeah.
Again, really good questions, aren't they? I recognise that issue that you've just outlined there, and I would say that we have extremely similar issues in the UK as well. Honestly, I think a lot of the problem comes back to the fact that the wider population out there doesn't always understand the importance of what civil engineers do, that the bits that are visible are not always the bits that are attractive, if that makes sense. And that is a really challenging position. However, I suppose to me, the only way we can go about that is we have to learn to explain ourselves better, and we have to speak to whether it's just generally to the wider public, but in particular to parents and school children, teachers, and so on, to make sure they do actually understand the wider impact of what we do. We know a whole generation of kids coming through now, and I think this is true all over the world actually, where they are more than aware of all of these global crisis points that are coming, whether we're talking about the climate crisis, whether we're talking about the biodiversity crisis, whether we're talking about the post-COVID side of things. We have a whole generation of people coming through who want to make a difference, a positive difference in the world. And that message feels like it could play really well at the moment. If we can make that connection so that people understand that, you know, if you want to actually make a practical difference, if you really want to contribute to, you know, trying to fix these huge global problems, actually civil engineering is a path where that is a reality. The challenge, of course, is that it's one thing to say it. The actual experience when people join then has to sort of match that. Otherwise, it's quite difficult, because you know, if the reality is very, very different, then clearly you end up with a problem when you want to keep people in the industry for the long run. Yeah, I think that there's a very long way to go on this. I think we do a good job in some places. I think as civil engineers and as a community of professional civil engineers, I do think and this is just a personal view, I think we need to open our minds to the idea that there are lots of people out there who could make fantastic civil engineers, even if they haven't necessarily studied or come across civil engineering until that point in their life so far. And I'm talking there not just about young kids, but even people through, you know, universities and through the degree course type things and so on. There are plenty of opportunities to work in our sectors, and to make a difference in those sectors, whether or not you happen to have come across the right materials already and had the right inspiration already. It strikes me that the one thing we're not going to be burdened with in the years ahead is a shortage of things to do, because civil engineers are at the heart of all of these big world problems, and because actually there's very few people who know how to take the policy or the strategy and turn it into a reality on the ground. We are not going to be short of things to do, and you would hope that that will help to add to the attractiveness as we go forward. But coming back to where you started, I would agree there is a long way to go here. There's a huge opportunity, if we want it, to really try to explain ourselves better and to get that message through and to reinforce it so that people do start to choose what we do in a more proactive way, I suppose. It's interesting, isn't it? Maybe it's one where we should all be working together much more closely, because I'm aware there are lots of places around the world with a similar challenge.
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. Allow me, I invite Athena to ask the next question, please.
Yeah, thank you. This question is interesting and related to the women in engineering. And there is more and more women working in the industry or studying civil engineering compared to the previous years. And I believe UK may encounter a similar trend as Hong Kong, because we always promote gender equality around the world. And to increase the retention of women in the engineering sector, is there any collaboration that we can make between the UK headquarters and the Hong Kong Association, such as some mentoring programs, so that our trainees or other members can join and we can have more women working in the industry?
Yes. The first thing I would say is I'm obviously quite keen on having more women working in engineering, because no, I think it is just so important. I don't see this just as a question about gender diversity, though. I think we all need, and definitely there are loads of parallels here between Hong Kong and the UK and many other places in the world. We all need to start to respect more realistically, I guess more openly, the fact that more diverse teams, not just gender, but also everything else to do with age, ethnicity, approach, style, learning, background, etc. We need to recognise the fact that more diverse teams make better decisions. And businesses where that tends to work well tend to be businesses that do better for the long run. Obviously, that needs to be done in an organised way. It doesn't just happen by magic, but it is absolutely proven that is the case. So in terms of how we go about it, yes, I think there are plenty of opportunities to collaborate on this side of things. I think you're right. There are trends. Some parts of the world are not following the same trend as this. Some have already managed to achieve a far more sort of gender balanced place already, but there are plenty of places around the world where we need to boost that level of diversity overall. And I do wonder whether there's an opportunity to actually start to form maybe some informal networks of people through which some of the mentoring and discussions could start to happen, through which people could just start to see role models across the world where people are in fact working in these careers. They have found ways through that retention challenge when life gets in the way and things get tricky for a few years and that kind of thing. These things are very real, but if anybody feels that they're on their own or they're the only ones experiencing that challenge, then that seems really unfortunate, because actually there are more of us here now. There is great people coming into civil engineering, and so I think yes, we should take proper advantage of that. There is an event actually running. It's aimed at the existing women who are fellows of the ICE. I think it's running in October sometime. I can't remember the exact date, but we're going to start to try some of these ideas in terms of forming a, just bringing together that particular cohort across the world and start to say, right, hang on a minute, how do we find more people like you? How do we make this work? And if that works well, we can obviously bring that, I guess, down through the different levels of membership and see whether or not there are things we could do there as well. Yeah, really, really crucial issue. Otherwise, we're designing and building for a community that we do not reflect, which is, never going to be the right answer.
Thank you, Rachel. May I go back to Ken for your next question, please?
Okay. Right. The question goes like this. There is a growing public concern on the delivery of infrastructure projects in terms of quality, program, and financial control, as well as sustainability and carbon neutrality aspects. Hong Kong is by no means an exception. While civil engineers are the key personnel in the project delivery process, what initiatives would our institution implement to help its members to rise to these challenges?
So I think that's, yes, it's a question to do with all these challenges, I guess, we very often run into, don't we, to do with change over the course of a project. One of the things that I see, and I guess I'd be interested to know if this reflects through to Hong Kong as well, that there is an incentive, certainly here in the UK, and I'm aware of other parts of the world where it would be similar. There's an incentive during the early stages of a project when you're trying to get approval and early stage funding to take it forward to the next stages and so on. There is obviously an incentive in keeping the costs to a sort of a minimum where you can, and where you try to be over ambitious perhaps on program, and at the same time you try, or you end up perhaps over promising on scope, and that scope I would sort of wrap up all the carbon impacts and that kind of thing. So in other words, over promising on some aspects and under promising on others. And what I think tends to happen at the moment is that as these projects move through the process, of course, the reality comes into play. And that's where we start to see changing costs and changing programs, and then a reduction sometimes in scope as people realise that actually they can't quite deliver everything that they had initially promised. And the danger of that approach, of course, is that we are sort of almost accidentally and subconsciously putting ourselves in a position where it always appears that things are going wrong. And so I wonder whether we need to try to find ways to, I suppose, be more realistic about all of those different aspects right from the beginning, and find ways to make sure that we haven't either under or over promised on those different aspects. And that it's easy to say, and of course it's very, very difficult to do, because we're all living now, especially post-COVID, in more constrained financial times. And anybody who wants funding to do different things, that circumstances now are extremely different to the way they might have been a couple of years ago. So the temptation might be to make these things worse rather than better. I wonder what we might do, and I'm not sure I have the answer at my fingertips on this one. It is certainly an area we might want to explore in terms of just having a more grown-up conversation around what is actually being committed, and being very, very clear that we're matching the cost and the programme against that scope, so we don't end up with a mismatch which then comes back to haunt us as time goes on.
Thank you, Rachel. Now, Louis, can you ask your second question, please?
Okay. This question is about collaboration.
So it say that climate challenge is very complex and cannot be solved simply by civil engineers. So the first question is which kind of organization or expertise do you find is the most important as our long-term partner? The second question is in your experience, do you encounter any challenge working with other non-civil engineers on this shaping civil thing?
So absolutely right. If only the answer to climate change lay with just one group of people, it would be a lot easier, wouldn't it, to go and sort it out. But in reality, this is a whole of society problem that's going to require a whole of society response. So I think our role from an ICE point of view is simply to put ourselves out there in the world as an organisation with something to say about the topic, with the ability to make change and some clarity around the bits that we can influence. And then in terms of collaboration and partnership, I think there is enormous potential to form all sorts of links, some of them quite informal, but because we get more visible in that space, we are able to engage in the conversation, whether it's to do with the financial commercial side of things, whether it's to do with the technology side of things, whether it's to do with the innovation and R&D side of things. It could be anything, couldn't it, really? I think that the first task for us, though, it's probably not so much for us to decide exactly who we should go and collaborate with. It's more about just being clear about what we bring to the table, because then I think it will become more obvious that actually we can just be a part of that senior level conversation where actual change is really coming through. In reality, these are all crucial stakeholders. Of course they are. And actually, I don't think it's a case of finding, a handful of partners. I think it's more around just making sure that we are engaged in that conversation as it actually flows, because in reality, if we're going to help to make fast change, the only way to do that is to be at the table. Otherwise, we're busy doing one thing while everybody else is busy doing something else, which isn't particularly helpful. On the second part of the question, I think you just remind me of the second part was to do with the Shaping Zero and whether people are. I can't remember exactly what the words were you used.
Do you encounter any challenges working with non-civil engineers in your net zero thing? Yeah.
Honestly, no. No. I think in a funny way, for the first time for a lot of people who've seen, for example, that Shaping Zero film, I think it's given a lot of people an insight into what we actually do, because it's so simply, well, in my mind at least, it's simply worded, it's not complicated, we're not trying to make it sound clever, we're just trying to say that this is really important, and that's the way that I intentionally wrote the script for that and so on. So no, I don't think I'm feeling any challenge or pressure from the wider world in this respect. I think there's a sense of relief that we're sort of helping to get onto this. Where I do find people being a bit more resistant is I do find there are some people who have worked for a long time in civil engineering, so people who are near the ends of their careers now, and in some cases they are able to embrace this change, but in other cases actually I think it's really difficult, because the message is not, it's not an easy message to hear, that actually for the entirety of their careers they've been causing harm, and nobody working in civil engineering comes in to cause harm. We don't come to work every day saying, hello, let's see how much harm I can do today. Quite the opposite, quite the opposite. We're all here because we want to do good, and I think it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. So I think for some people that has been a difficult message, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens next, because obviously some of those people are in very senior roles. They have a lot of influence, and what they say will matter. So I suppose my task quietly is to try to keep pushing people in the right direction as best I can. So yes.
Thank you, Rachel. Athena, can you ask the next question, please?
Okay. In Hong Kong, because of the complicated environment and the fast pace of work, and many young engineers, especially the graduates, may feel confused on their career path, and people sometimes are quite stressful about their works. And according to your previous experience working as an engineer, how would you encourage the graduates to enjoy their engineering life and further develop their interest in the engineering so that they can strengthen the passion to shape our city?
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? The people who want to, who are really good at what they do and get busy with what they do and so on. It's a challenge, isn't it? Because it is stressful at times. One of the things that I've found personally over the years that has just been hugely valuable to me is just try to lift my eyes beyond what I'm doing specifically at one time, so my own projects, that kind of thing, to lift up and just start to look around and just see the huge range of all the different things that people do, and to just feel a part of that much bigger community. Because at that point, I think the weight on your own personal shoulders somehow is eased a little bit, because actually you can see that, you know, you're surrounded by people who are also working hard and are equally passionate about what they do. I do think that at the moment in particular, and especially with COVID, I think we do have some challenges. I don't know if it's similar in Hong Kong, but in terms of people taking care of themselves, taking time away from work and making sure they're finding the right sort of balance between professional life and personal life and other things they want to do. But the other thing I guess I would immediately go to in terms of things I've found really useful over the years is just the value of building networks and being a part of various different professional networks that exist out there. And some of them are very formal, and I mean, even being part of the ICE, of course, is one thing, because people choose to be a member of the ICE's network and so on. But beyond that, there are so many ways to get involved, either within the ICE or well beyond it, and just form a community of people who can support and mentor and just generally help you to see get some perspective, I guess, in terms of the fact that, you know, yes, things are busy, but hang on a minute, you know, let's just make sure we're being sensible about this. You know, if you're being set ridiculous deadlines, or if you're you know, you feel this pressure to deliver that's beyond what you can actually do, finding ways to speak up, finding ways to talk about that, and to make sure, and I guess taking advice from people who've been there and who've done that for many years, through your networks and so on, finding ways to get that under control and more manageable has to be a good thing in the end, in terms of the outcome of that particular project, but also, you know, your own sort of personal way of doing things. It's a really crucial part of anybody working in our space, because, as I said before, you know, one thing we're not going to be short of is things to do, and it can, I think, become quite overwhelming, that feeling of stress and pressure and so on. But there's something about being part of that community, part of that network, where everybody is working towards the same thing, which I think does help with that a bit. I'm not sure if I've quite answered your question, but to me, that's where I go.
Thank you, Rachel, for your sharing. I'm conscious about the time, so that will be the last two questions. So first of all, may I invite Ken to ask the next question, please?
Okay. What kind of collaboration do you think ICE in different regions could do to engage more civil engineers around the world, especially young engineers?
I think we should be doing much more. I think the ICE is at a point where we have this enormous maturity. We are more than able to start to act more internationally, to connect people together, and to take the very best from the different regions, and to really start to think about how we bring that through for the benefit of others around the world. That, especially with the younger engineers, it's something that really genuinely excites me, actually, in terms of just finding ways to get that to work better. I think COVID might hold the key there, because actually the fact that we can do all of this virtual working and remote working and have meaningful conversations without physically needing to bring everybody together at the same place at the same time all the time, will prove to be really beneficial from that side of things. So yes, I would be really keen to think that through in terms of how we get better at that joining up, that collaboration, that knowledge sharing and so on across the world.
Thank you, Rachel. The last question goes to Louis. Louis, please.
Okay. This question about CPR. The participant agreed to need to beef up the sustainable development attribute in the CPR.
Good.
So the best way, the right way to go is to include UN SDG. So the question is what IC has done or will do to help the CPR candidate to understand more about UN SDG?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. It comes back to those changes to do with the chartered professional review process and the requirements and so on. So what has happened already is that a lot of work has gone on in order to make sure that we've defined the attributes, updated those definitions to reflect exactly what you've just said there. So to making sure essentially that civil engineers from now have to understand where those UN Sustainable Development Goals fit in to what they do. And not everybody has to be across everything, but we do have to each be able to explain where the links actually are. In terms of helping people through that process, there is a lot of work going on now in terms of producing training materials, updating some of the information, that kind of thing. And of course, there is already a lot of information out there to do with the Sustainable Development Goals that anybody can go and find in any case. So I think in the past, we simply haven't pointed people towards some of that. But I know that the knowledge team is doing quite a bit of work to think about, you know, how we find the best materials that are already there, supplement them with ICE materials that people would need to start to understand. And hopefully then it won't be that much of a jump for people to be able to fulfill that attribute going forward. I suppose one of the other things we can do as we start to see the really strong submissions from people in each of the professional review rounds is we can start to share information around what is working really well for people in terms of how to present that at professional review and how to make sure that people have covered the breadth. But we just need the time to roll the process through a few times first so we can start to see that. So yeah, there is definitely help coming. But in the meantime, I think there's a lot people can do just to help themselves as well, because we're not inventing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, they're already out there. So people should be more than able to make some of these links for themselves.
Thank you, Rachel, for your sharing. I think we are about time to finish this webinar. And it's also about time to finish the presidential visit to Hong Kong. So before we finish, would Rachel like to share a few words with our Hong Kong members?
Sure, no, just very briefly. I think overriding everything really, I would just like to say thank you. Actually, I know some of you have been into several of these events over the last 3 days, and it has been really fantastic just to understand how the Hong Kong ICE side of things works, all the interactions with the other professional institutions and that side of things, and just to get a bit closer to it and get to know some of you. Such a shame I can't be there in person. I think some of you probably heard me say several times now, I've never been to Hong Kong. I would have loved to have come over, but never mind. One day I will get there. But no, absolutely fantastic. I will take away a lot of the suggestions and the thoughts and the topics that we've talked about in this session, but also in the others as well, and make sure that that's fed back round into the wider ICE setup, so that we can make sure that we get better at joining things together with the things that matter most to all of you in Hong Kong. Because if we can get that more right, it will benefit others around the world as well, which is obviously the whole point of trying to be more collaborative and make sure that we're addressing what people need. So yes, no, thank you very much. And hopefully one day, as I say, I'll get to Hong Kong and I'll actually be able to meet some of you in person.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for your sharing, and thank you for the virtual visit to Hong Kong. And we really hope to see you one day in person in Hong Kong. Thank you, the panelists, Louis, Ken, and Frida. I think that's time to conclude today's session and the presidential visit to Hong Kong. Thank you all for joining us today or in the last 2 days. Thank you and have a good evening. Bye bye.